that you are having a good day so far. All right, so today we will be doing our lesson, our grade 7 English lesson on direct and indirect objects. So we'll be doing our grade 7 English lesson on direct and indirect objects. And before we go into what direct and indirect objects are, we are going to log into aplusstudents.ca. We're going to log in with our username as well as our password. Then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 7. And then we are going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of direct and indirect objects. All right. So once we are by the chapter of direct and indirect objects, all right, so our chapter is direct and indirect objects. Our subject is English, which is language arts, grade 7. And then our focus lesson is it a direct object or an indirect object? So is it a direct object or an indirect object? So that is going to be our lesson today under the chapter of direct and indirect objects. And a direct object, right? If we define direct and indirect objects, a direct object is a pronoun, a noun or a noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And to find the direct object in a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and ask what or whom is it acting on. So direct object is the pronoun, or it can be the noun, or it can be a noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. So the subject receives the action, the receives the action of a verb. And to find the direct object within a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and ask what or whom it is acting on. So direct object, right? We said is an object in which the verb is acting on. And if we look at an example, right? In the sentence, he sold his car. So we look at this, if we look at the specific sentence, he sold his car. So the word car, so the sentence is he sold his car. So the word car within that sentence is a direct object. So car, let me move this up a bit. Let me do that. So car. So we have a sentence which is he sold his car, right? So car within that sentence is a direct object. So he sold his car. So the word car within that sentence is a direct object. And an indirect object is the recipient of the direct object, right? It's the recipient of the direct object. For example, if we look at the sentence, the man gave his wife a necklace, then we would say necklace is the direct object. It is something that was given, and the recipient is the wife, which means that in this case, if we look at this one, then it means that he, right, is the indirect object. So he's or he is the indirect object. Because in this case, the case of if we look at this one, if the man gave his wife a necklace, right? We said that the direct object is the necklace. So necklace is the direct object. And then wife, the recipient, is the indirect object. Because remember, we said that a direct object, right? It is either a pronoun, a noun, or a noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And in order for us to find a direct object, we need to ask ourselves what or who is acting on. And there we have another example. John bought his son a present. So the direct object within that sentence is a present, and the indirect object is his son. So John bought his son a present, and a present is a direct object, and his son is an indirect object. And if we now look at the difference again of the direct object as well as the indirect object, right? Then we will say that the direct object, right, is the receiver of the action. The receiver of the action expressed by the verb. So it is the receiver of the action. And remember, we said that in order to answer the questions, right, we need to ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on, right? What or whom it is acting on. And then we have an indirect object. And we said the indirect object is the receiver of the direct object. And this tells us to whom or what or for whom or for what the action is performed. And an example of an indirect object. For example, he bought me an umbrella, right? So to whom or for whom is the action performed? Me, right? So me is the indirect object. And if we look at that very same sentence, he bought me an umbrella. If we look at the direct object, right, the receiver of the action, and then we would say it's umbrella. So umbrella is the direct object. So what did he buy? He bought an umbrella. So that is our direct, and we have our indirect objects. And remember, they say that when it comes to the direct object, it's the receiver of the action. And the action is, for example, bought. It's the verb. What did we buy? An umbrella, right? And we bought an umbrella for who? For me. And me being the indirect object. So that is basically direct object and indirect object. So now we're going to our tutorial lesson on direct and indirect objects. And our focus lesson is it a direct object or an indirect object? All right. So once again, a direct object, it is a pronoun, a noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. So it receives the action of the verb. And in order to find a direct object within a sentence, we need to locate the action or the action verb. And we need to ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. For example, Jane admires her neighbor. So Jane admires her neighbor. So it's like asking yourself, who does Jane admire? Right? So who does Jane admire? Jane admires her neighbor. So that being the direct object. So her neighbor is a direct object within the sentence. It's like asking ourselves, whom does Jane admire? And then we have another example, which is Charlie baked a cake. So it's like asking yourself, what did Charlie bake? And then we say a cake. And that is our direct object. So what did Charlie bake? A cake. And a cake being our direct object. Let me choose a different color. So some verbs, right, that have a direct object can also have an indirect object. So some verbs that have a direct object, they can also have an indirect object. And an indirect object, it is the pronoun, the noun, or the noun phrase that receives the direct object of the verb. And the direct object, it always appears between a verb and its direct object. And in order for us to find the indirect object within the sentence, we need to find the verb. Locate the verb, locate the action verb. And then we also need to select or locate the direct object, because remember we said that our indirect object, it is, or it always appears in between the verb as well as the direct object. So in order for you to find the indirect object, then it means that you need to locate your verb as well as the direct object. And then you need to ask yourself to what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed. An example, right, is Charlie baked his mom a cake. So if we select the indirect object, then we can say it's his mom. And his mom is an indirect object, and it is between baked, which is a verb, and a cake, which is the direct object. So his mom is the indirect object within that sentence. And remember, try and not to confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition. Because an object of a preposition is a pronoun, a noun, or noun phrase that comes directly after a preposition, such as to, for, in, under, or during. All right, we are continuing. And an example of a preposition or an object of a preposition, right? We can say Charlie baked a cake for his mom. So, yeah, his mom is an object of the preposition, and his mom is not an indirect object. And how do we know that? And you can tell that because his mom comes directly after the preposition for. All right, let's go about activities. Is the word in bold a direct object or an indirect object? For Chinese New York, my aunt cooks us traditional pork dumplings. We need to say if it is a direct or an indirect object. Us, direct or indirect object. And if we look at the word us, then we will say it is an indirect object. And how do we know it is an indirect object? Because we said that in order for us to locate the indirect object, right, it needs to be in between. Us being indirect object, right, it's between the verb and the direct object, which is traditional pork dumplings. So we need to say if the word in bold is a direct or an indirect object. So the postal clerk handed me a certificate letter, a certified letter. So we need to say if this is a direct or indirect object, me. Remember, we said that if we ought to look for either the direct or indirect object, then try to look at the verb. So if we look at the word me, and then we will say it is an indirect object, right? It's an indirect object and it sits between, which is handed, which is the verb, and certified letter. Yes. So that is how you try and either locate or you'll be able to see the differences between a direct object as well as an indirect object. And remember, we said, right, if the word comes after a preposition, then it is not a direct or indirect object because now it is a prepositional object. So the last one, we need to say if this is a direct object or an indirect object. So the yoga instructor taught the beginners a few basic poses. So the yoga instructor taught the beginners a few basic poses. So we need to say if it is a direct or indirect object. The beginners. So basically, if we were to look, or if we were to find either the direct or the indirect object, then we will say at the beginners, it is an indirect object. And if we were to first locate the verb, there we have the verb, and there we have, for example, the object, the direct object, which is few basic poses. And remember, we said that our indirect object it sits between the verb as well as the direct object. All right. Now we're going on to our test. All right, so now we're going to have to say if the word in bold is either a direct object or an indirect object. Kim owes Laverne $20 for last night's dinner. Kimmy owes Laverne $20 for last night's dinner. So the word Laverne, Laverne in bold, we need to say if that is a direct object or we need to say if it's an indirect object. Laverne. And remember, we said that in order for us to see, we need to locate the verb and we locate the object, and then in between the verb and the object, that is where we said the indirect object is. So which means that Laverne is an indirect object. Remember, we said that it is the indirect object is between the verb as well as the object, the direct object. And it is in between there. We have our verb, and this is our direct object. So this is an indirect object. Farmers often feed their dairy cattle high protein alfalfa hay. We need to say if that is a direct object or indirect object. High protein alfalfa hay. Is that a direct object or indirect object? And if we look at or if we select if it's a direct object or an indirect object, then we will say it is a direct object. So we can say it's a direct object. And yes, direct object, well done. So if you selected direct object, then well done, well done. Mimi offered an elderly man his seat on the bus. First, try and look at where our words in bold are. Look at where the words in bold is. Is that a direct object or an indirect object? So an elderly man. Mimi offered an elderly man her seat on the bus. Is that a direct object or an indirect object? So if we look at the word an elderly man, right? An elderly man is between the verb as well as the direct object. So we will say this is an indirect object. And yes, if you said indirect object, then well done. It is an indirect object. Ryan sent his aunt a thank you card for her thoughtful graduation gift. We need to say if this is a direct object or indirect object. Ryan sent his aunt a thank you card for her thoughtful graduation gift. We need to say if it's a direct or indirect object. All right, so if we say, let's go with direct object, a thank you card. And a direct object is correct, so well done. Well done. Bobby caught us a huge catfish for lunch. So Bobby caught us a huge catfish for lunch. So a huge catfish, is this a direct object or indirect object? Direct object or indirect object? A huge catfish. And if we select the correct one, let us choose a direct object. And a direct object is correct. So well done. Well done. Good job. And the yoga instructor taught me at the beginning, taught the beginners a few basic poses. So the yoga instructor taught the beginners a few basic processes. Is that a direct or indirect object? So the yoga instructor taught the beginners a few basic poses. So the beginners. All right, so if we select the correct one, we will say indirect object. Remember we said that the indirect object, it is between the verb so we will say indirect object. It's in between the verb, which is taught, and the direct object, which is a few basic poses. All right, so this is an indirect object. Remember, when it comes to an indirect object, if you see that the word in bold is literally that comes after the verb, right? If it directly comes after the verb, so which means that if it's in between the verb as well as the direct object, then that is the indirect object. And Devon sent her grandmother a postcard from Chicago. So Devon sent her grandmother a postcard from Chicago. Is this a direct object or indirect object? A postcard. So what was sent? That is the question you need to ask. What was sent? So we can say a postcard. So it is a direct object. As. So if the word as, cooks, it then comes after cooks. So as comes after cooks, which means that this is an indirect object. So the salesman offered his customer a discount. Is that a we need to say if the word a discount is a direct object or indirect object. All right, so if we look at the correct one, we will say it is a direct object. All right. Now we're going to do one more. The trainer at the gym showed Britt a simple exercise routine. So the trainer at the gym showed Britt a simple exercise routine. Is this a simple exercise routine? Is this a direct object or an indirect object? So we will say this is a direct object. So we can say this is a direct object. All right, so that is correct. It is a direct object. It is the receiver of the action. All right. So just to recap on a direct and indirect object, we said that a direct object, it is either a noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And in order for us to find the correct object in a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and ask what or whom it is acting on. And some verbs have a direct object, can also have an indirect object, right? And we said an indirect object is a pronoun, a noun, or a noun phrase that receives the action or receives and direct the object of the verb. It receives the direct object of the verb. All right. Now we're going to our test. We're going to our test. Oh, we already did the test. Sorry. So that was basically just us recapping on what a direct, and an indirect object is. I apologize for wanting to go to the test. We already did the test. We just recapped what a direct object is as well as an indirect object is. And we say a direct object is the receiver of the action. So don't forget to ask yourself what or whom is it acting on? Right? All right, so that is now the end of our lesson, grade 7, on direct and indirect object. Thank you very much for being interactive, and you should have an amazing day further. Bye.